anymore. Oh Lord, you know I have no friend like you. If heaven's not my home, then Lord, what will I do? The angels beckon me from heaven's open door, and I can't feel at home in this world anymore.
We started this morning looking at the phrase that the Apostle Peter used in 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 10, where he says there, be even more diligent to make your call and election sure. And we were talking about that word call and the difference in the way that the word call is used in the English New Testament as opposed to the Greek words there. And we notice that there are different Greek words that are translated call or called or calls or calling. And the one that Peter uses here is one that refers to the lifestyle or the state that we are in when we obey the gospel of Christ. We're called by the gospel. That's one word that is used. And having been called by the gospel, we have a calling in the sense of a profession or in the sense of a manner of living. So that would be the difference between those words call and calling or called. And so we want to continue looking at that this evening. We had looked at a couple of passages this morning, 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 10, where we started out, the text that we looked at there. And then Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 1, that passage that was used in the definition of the word from Loanita, and we looked at that passage. And we'll go back over to Ephesians chapter 4 and look at verses 1 through 4 here in just a minute, because it's used again the same way it's used in verse 1, where the two different words for call are used in verse 1. They're flipped in verse 4, and both words are used again in verse 4. And we'll look at that in just a moment. But we want to start out this evening looking at how the word is used in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 20. There's a couple of reasons I wanted to come to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Mainly in the course of this word and the study of this word, we see how the word is used here in the sense of a lifestyle or in a state that a person is in. Because the way it's used here is not used in reference to the Christian life, but rather is used in reference to the condition that a person is in, or the state that a person is in, regarding their marriage, or regarding their profession, or regarding their social status, slave or free, and that their obedience to the gospel really doesn't affect that state that they're in. They're supposed to continue in that state and apply the gospel to that state that they're in. And we'll look at that. Let me start with verse 17 and read down through verse 24. And I want you to notice how many times the word called is used here in this passage. The first time you see it used is actually back in verse 15. But the context of our statement we're going to look at, verse 17 to 24, notice how many times the word called is used. But only one of those uses is the word that we're looking at. That means a state of life or a state of being. Notice, beginning in verse 17. But as God has distributed to each one, as the Lord has called each one. Now the word called there is the word that means to summon or to beckon. It's the call of the gospel. So Paul is referring there to people hearing the gospel and responding to the gospel. But as God has distributed to each one, as the Lord has called each one, so let him walk. And so I ordain in all the churches. Was anyone called, or that is, did they hear and obey the gospel? Did they hear and respond to the gospel? Was anyone called while circumcised, that is, Jews? Let him not become uncircumcised. And so there, the Apostle Paul referring to the fact that this person was living like a Jew. And the statement here indicating that his response to the gospel doesn't mean that he has to turn away from or to give up those parts of the Jewish lifestyle that were cultural, that weren't religious practices. You know, there's a lot of the things about Judaism that had become part of their culture, like their dietary laws. It was part of their culture that they didn't eat certain meats. Well, they could still choose not to eat certain meats, as Paul talks about in other places, in both 1 Corinthians and in Romans chapter 14. They could still choose not to eat certain meats if they wanted to, but it was no longer part of their religious practice. If they wanted to observe that as part of a cultural preference, that was fine. If I decide that there are certain things that I don't want to eat, that's fine. I can do that. But I can't bind that as a matter of religious doctrine. So that's what Paul's talking about here. Was he called while circumcised? Well, he doesn't have to change those things about the culture of being a Jewish person to obey the gospel. He can apply the gospel to those things. But he can't bind the law of Judaism in a doctrinal way. So notice here he's referring to things that are cultural. And saying that if that's the culture you were in, or that was your cultural observances, or your manner when you heard and responded to the gospel, you know, continue in that. And apply the gospel to that. Now, of course, we understand he's not talking about things that would be contrary to the gospel, like in Romans chapter 1, beginning verse 18, and the lifestyle of paganism, that caused people to turn away from God, that caused people to reject God. Certainly, he's not talking about those kinds of things here. But rather, he's talking about things that are purely of a cultural nature, that don't contradict the gospel in and of themselves. You can still live in that culture and apply the gospel to that culture. For example, we apply the gospel in this country to our Western culture, to our American culture. We apply the gospel to that, and we live the gospel lifestyle in a culture that is very different from, for example, Christians in India. The culture there, the way that they apply the gospel, the way that they express the gospel in that culture is very different from the way that we apply it and practice it here. We hold to the same doctrines, we follow the same pattern of religion, the same worship, the same morality. All of those things are the same, but we apply those in different cultures. So that's what Paul is talking about here. And so he says, was anyone called while circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. That is, you don't have to stop living in that culture because you obeyed the gospel. Was anyone called while uncircumcised? Well, that would be Gentiles. Let him not be circumcised. That is, and this would specifically have application to those Judaizing teachers that were trying to bind Judaism on Gentiles when they obeyed the gospel. And Paul's saying here, these Gentiles that are obeying the gospel, they don't have to change their culture and adapt the Jewish culture because they obeyed the gospel. They can apply the gospel to the culture that they were in when they obeyed the gospel. That's the point. It's the cultural setting that the people were in when they obeyed the gospel. Paul says you don't have to change that. Now, of course, again, I have to emphasize, he's not talking about cultural things that would contradict the gospel. For example, in the American culture, it's very sad, it's heartbreaking that every year millions of unborn babies are legally murdered, legally killed in abortion. the American culture, really part of the Western culture, as the European countries are very adapted to abortion and the legalization of abortion. And it's become part of this culture, very sadly, very reproachfully, that when someone becomes pregnant because they've been a fornicator outside of marriage, that rather than accepting the responsibility for the mistake that they made in living that kind of lifestyle outside of marriage, that kind of sinful lifestyle that the gospel says you can't go to heaven living that way, rather than doing the right thing, it's become part of the culture to compound error with error and to say, since I've been guilty of fornication and have become pregnant or impregnated somebody as a fornicator, then I'm going to murder the child to be relieved of that responsibility. And that's part of the culture. It's sinful. It's evil. It's wicked. Certainly, Paul is not saying here, well, if that's part of your culture, if that's what you're used to, well, then you can continue doing that once you obey the gospel. No, you can't. It's part of the American culture to drink socially, to go out to parties, and to drink together. It's becoming more and more part of the culture to do drugs together. Well, certainly Paul is not talking about those kinds of things that have become part of the culture through sinful rebellion of God. That is not what Paul's talking about here. Paul's talking about those elements of our culture. For example, in India, when women pray, they cover their head. When, not just when they pray, but most places I was in India, when they come into the place of worship, they cover their head. When they read their Bible in their daily devotions, they cover their head with a scarf. That's part of that culture. That's part of the Asian culture. Well, you don't have to stop doing that when you obey the gospel. That's what Paul's talking about here. So, yes, there are things that have become part of the culture through the tolerance and acceptance of sin. That's not what Paul's talking about in this passage. Then there are those parts of our culture that are really matters of indifference when it comes to living the gospel. And we can apply the gospel to that culture. We apply the gospel in the American culture. In China, they apply the gospel to the Oriental culture. In India, they apply the gospel to the Asian culture. And the gospel applies to every culture everywhere. And where that culture has accepted and tolerated things that are sinful, the application of the gospel to that culture would have those things removed and get those things out of the culture. And so Paul is referring to being able to apply the gospel in the different cultures where it goes. And you remember Paul said that he became all things to all men. To the Jews, he became as a Jew. That is, he was sensitive to their cultural sensibilities when he was preaching to the Jews. When he was with the Gentiles, he said he became as a Gentile. He was sensitive to their cultural sensibilities when he was with the Gentiles. And so, that's what he's talking about here. So he says, was anyone called while uncircumcised? Let him not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing. See, it's cultural issues that are irrelevant to the observance of the gospel. You can apply the gospel in these settings without damaging the gospel. Circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping the commandments of God is what matters. So you apply the gospel in the culture that you're in. Let each one, now here's what he says, let each one remain in the same calling. So there you see that word calling. This is the word that we've been studying this morning and looking at this evening. You see how the word calling there refers to the cultural practices of the person that is obeying the gospel. And where those cultural practices can then that's well and good. And so he says, let each one remain in the same calling in which he was called. Were you called while a slave? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can be made free, rather use it. So you can apply the gospel to the culture of servitude. He says, for he who is called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freedman. Likewise, he who is called while free is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men. Brethren, let each one remain with God in the state in which he was called. So you see there in verse 24, remain with God in that state would be parallel with verse 20, let each one remain in that same calling. So remain in that state is the same thing as remain in that calling. So the word calling there is being used in reference to the manner of lifestyle or the customs that the person holds to. And we want to point that out because the other passages where we see this word used, it's referring to the Christian lifestyle. See, we've been called by the gospel, and in obedience to the gospel, having heard the word of God and believing what it teaches about Christ and his kingdom, believing that, repenting of our sins, and confessing that we believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God, we've been baptized into Christ to have our sins washed away by his blood. Coming up from the watery grave of baptism, we were raised in newness, to walk in newness of life. Well, that newness of life is our Christian calling. As we responded to the gospel's call, we have a calling, and that calling is to live the Christian lifestyle. But I want to point out something here in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 before we move on, because as I said this morning, when we're looking at this word, I like to study the Greek words. And studying the Greek words, there are two different Greek words. Kelio, which means to summon, it's the gospel's call. You know, when someone hears the gospel, it's like they're hearing God say, hey, come to me. It's a summons in that way. The word we're looking at, klesis, is a state of being or a state of relationship. A manner of lifestyle, if you will. And you remember I said, you don't have to know the Greek words to be able to tell the difference. You can look at the context of where the words are used, and you can tell how it's being used by the context of where you find the word. Well, 1 Corinthians chapter 7 is a great chapter of Scripture to demonstrate the importance of context. Not just textual context, right? We look at the text and we keep the statements in the text in their textual context, but also historical context. That is, what was the historical setting when it was written? We refer to that a lot of times when we're studying a book, we're studying a text. We point out that it's good to know who wrote it, right? The Apostle Paul wrote it, right? When it was written, and that would be the historical context. What was the purpose of it being written? That is, what is Paul doing? Well, what is his purpose in writing to the Corinthians? That would be the circumstantial, or there's different terms for it, but it's the context that prompted what is being written, the purpose of its being written. So there's a contextual setting there. And when we look at who it's being written to, the Corinthian church, when it was written, very, very soon after the establishment of the Corinthian church. So the historical context of 1 Corinthians chapter 7 is very shortly after the church was established. In other words, the people that originally received this letter, the original audience of this letter, were all new converts, essentially. They were all new Christians. And the purpose of the writing, we get all through the book, Paul is addressing the problem of division in the church because they were being divided up for different reasons over who baptized them, over social status, over what spiritual gifts they had. They were being divided up over all manner of things, and Paul was addressing these points of division and correcting the points of division. Well, when we come to chapter 7, we see that Paul is also answering some questions that he had been asked. Right? If you turn back to chapter 1, and you get the context for why he was writing this, he says there in verse 11, "For it has been declared to me concerning you, my brethren, by those of Chloe's household, that there are contentions among you." So some from Corinth had contacted Paul to ask Paul, how do we handle this situation with these contentions, with these divisions? Well, they had asked Paul some questions. And in the letter of 1 Corinthians, it's kind of like listening to someone on the phone, right? You can hear what they're saying to the person on the other end of the phone. And sometimes you can tell what the other person said, even though you can't hear them. You can tell what the other person said by the way that the person there with you, it responds to them. Right? You hear your husband or your wife or one of your kids on the phone. That's why sometimes you snatch the phone away from your kids and say, what are y'all talking about? Because you can tell by the response that they're talking about. You can get an idea of what they're talking about. Well, that's kind of what you get here in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. There was a question about marriage. And the Apostle Paul, if you were listening to the Apostle Paul on the phone, you would have been able to tell that the person he was talking to, the Corinthians, had just asked him a question about marriage because of the way he responded to them. So they had asked this question about marriage, and so Paul says there in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 1, "Now concerning the things of which you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality or fornication, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does, and likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you concerning your lack of self-control." And so he starts this chapter talking about marriage and the right relationship between husbands and wives. Well, what would have prompted that question? Well, as you read on down through the passage, apparently there was a question about whether or not the Christians ought to be giving their daughters in marriage. And Paul says, yes. It would be good for you to keep them, but if you can't keep them, then give them in marriage. That's fine. And when you look at verse 11, "But even if she does not depart, let her remain." Well, no, let me back up to verse 7. "For I wish that all men were even as I myself, but each one has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that." So when Paul says, "I wish that all men were even as I myself," he's talking about being unmarried. But there's a contextual statement here that shows why Paul says it would be better to remain unmarried. If you can't remain unmarried, if you need to get married, then get married, he says. But it would be better if you stayed single. That's what he's talking about there. Well, when you go over to verse 26, you see in the context of the chapter why he says it would be better to remain unmarried. He says, "I suppose, therefore, that this is good because of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is," that is, unmarried. So why is it that Paul, in response to their question about marriage, says that it would be better to remain unmarried? Because there have been those, there's a world religion that has taken that and said, well, we're gonna bind celibacy on our priesthood because Paul said it would be better to remain unmarried. Well, that's not what Paul was teaching there. It's because of the present distress. See, that's historical context. Because the church was undergoing persecution. And Paul says here that it would be much easier for a person to bear up under that persecution if he only had himself to worry about. But you talk about making it hard on a person. They come and they take your wife and they start torturing your wife in front of you, telling you to deny Christ or they're going to kill your wife, or they take your children and they start persecuting your children in front of you and say, deny Christ or we're going to kill your children. That's going to be much harder to bear up under that kind of persecution. That's why Paul says that it would be better to remain single. That's the historical context for Paul saying that it would be better to remain single. Paul is not saying there that it's better to be single than to be married in every circumstance. That the condition of being single is always better than the condition of being married. That's not what Paul's saying there. There's a historical context that has to be considered here. And so when we recognize that, there's also historical context to everything else Paul says here. For example, when he's talking about believers being married to unbelievers, he's not talking about someone who is a Christian going out and choosing an unbelieving spouse for themselves. That is not what he's talking about. In the historical context, he's writing to new converts that were already married when they were converted. And he says, and that goes back to our passage where we were looking at the word calling. Stay in the state that you were called. Remain in the same calling in which he was called, he says there. Well, the context there is in the marriage with the unbeliever. So they had asked Paul, well, I'm a Christian now. I obey the gospel, and my spouse didn't. So do I have to leave my spouse now that I'm a Christian and they're not? See, he's talking to people who were already married when they were converted. And Paul says, no, you stay with them, because the sanctity of marriage is right and good. You stay with them. But if they leave, that is, if they can't tolerate your Christian lifestyle, now that you're a Christian, and they just can't tolerate you being a Christian and they leave you, let them leave. But remain unmarried. The only time that this passage, this chapter even touches on the question of marriage, divorce, and remarriage, the Apostle Paul says, if they leave, let them leave. You can either be reconciled back to them or remain unmarried. Yet some people come over here to the passage we read just a moment ago, and they'll say, see there's a Pauline privilege. In addition to what Jesus said. When Jesus said, lest the divorce be for reasons of fornication, you can't get remarried. Matthew chapter 19 verse 9. They'll say, well, the Apostle Paul gave another exception over here. And that is, if you were divorced and remarried before you were baptized, well, then you can stay in that marriage. And they come over here to get that. And that is not at all what Paul is teaching here. That has nothing at all to do with the context here. Paul is not teaching on marriage, divorce, and remarriage here. And again, the only time he refers to separation in this passage, he specifically says they have to either stay unmarried or be reconciled to their spouse. He doesn't say anything about remarriage here. Notice verse 10. Now to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. That is, this is the doctrine of Christ. Because he had stated his inspired opinion just prior to this. Now he's giving the doctrine of Christ. He says, now to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. A wife is not to depart from her husband, but even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. Now that seems pretty clear to me. You can't if your unbelieving spouse leaves you, that doesn't mean you can go and get remarried to somebody else. You can be reconciled to them, or you can remain unmarried. And so, the historical setting, the historical context of this statement is talking to new converts that were already married when they were converted. Because when Paul does start talking about people getting married as Christians, he says to marry only in the Lord. The Bible nowhere endorses mixed marriages. Nowhere. Now, of course, when we talk about mixed marriages in the church, we're not talking about ethnicity. We're talking about spirituality. Nowhere in the Bible does the Bible teach that it is right and good for a believer to marry an unbeliever. And this passage certainly does not teach that. Because we have to keep it in its historical context. And so we have that word calling there. Well, I don't have time to get into these further passages in Ephesians 1:18 and Ephesians 4:4 and Philippians 3:14. See, I've got those colored together because I want to cover those together, and we'll do that as we continue this lesson, Lord willing, next week. But it may be this evening that you know that you've heard the gospel's call. And having heard the gospel's call, you know that the only way to be in that calling of a Christian is to obey the gospel of Christ. To having heard the gospel, to come in humble obedience, to be baptized into Christ. And having done that, to live in that manner of life that the gospel prescribes. That is the Christian calling. And if you're not living according to your calling this evening, then we pray that you would be quick to repent and ask God's forgiveness so that we can together live according to the truth of God's Word. It's so important to study God's Word in its context and to make correct application of it to our lives. If we can help you do that in whatever way you need to do that, we pray that we'll come on, students.
All to